But let me start with my presentation. The countries that I'm talking about actually looked at the beginning of the crisis rather vulnerable, and they came out of the crisis looking actually better than some of the countries that we are now very worried about. And so to some extent they managed the crisis well. However, that doesn't mean that there weren't certain problems and serious problems, and certainly problems in the labor market. This is why this topic is really quite important for us. And I will talk about three issues, essentially: employment responses to the crisis in Central and Eastern Europe, and related to that, the structural features of the employment responses, the issue of unemployment, and some future labor, and we'll conclude with some future labor market prospects. What you can see in this slide is that the employment in Central and Eastern European countries was really, the employment situation was worse. The countries were hit harder, with one big exception, and that exception was Poland. So this is why in all my slides you will see I will mostly talk about the new member states, and you will see the 9 new member states of Central and Eastern Europe without Poland, because Poland was one of the few countries that actually managed during this recession to record the GDP growth, and also has had a good performance, or a relatively good performance, on the labor market.
Because of the connections with Germany, I guess, right?
No, not really, because it had a rather large internal market, and domestic demand was actually the one feature that kept the economy going. But you should see this performance at the backdrop of rather low employment ratios that those countries have compared to Western European countries. So still employment ratios and participation hasn't reached the level that it has in Western European countries. So this is why this bad performance makes things in a certain case really worse. And of course there are several reasons, and it has not been spread equally over all countries. You see that, for example, countries with a fixed exchange rate regime did relatively worse than countries with a flexible rate regime. This is maybe not surprising, because obviously also countries like Poland had the possibility to devalue and therefore sort of keep their competitiveness. The same was true for Hungary or Romania, but on the other hand, particularly Baltic countries were hit rather hard, and so were countries such as Bulgaria or Slovakia, that really had the only possibility to really cut employment, and they cut employment dramatically. What we see now is that employment really hasn't really reached the levels that it had before the crisis. If you look at industrial sectors, what is quite striking is that the crisis hit particularly hard the manufacturing and the construction sector. So these were the sectors that were particularly hit, and that actually also had to do with the connection to Germany of some countries, because many of the Central and Eastern European countries are actually small open economies. And for that reason, they are very much integrated into international production networks, and as soon as the order stopped, production in a way stopped. So there was really a rather dramatic decline, and these countries also didn't really have sophisticated financial markets. So the transmission mechanism of the crisis was really much more trade, and therefore so the effect on the real economy was much stronger than possibly in other countries. As it was the manufacturing and the construction industry, it's probably not coming as a surprise that males to a certain extent were hit harder than females, because they are more concentrated in those sectors. What has already been said, but was really striking, and I think is sort of a matter of concern, that young people were hit much more strongly than older people. There's one exception to the sort of rest of the Western European countries or other OECD countries, that in the Central and Eastern European countries there was also some decline in the older age groups, but in general still it doesn't compare to what the younger people, the amount of that younger people were affected. Again, the skill structure is similar to other countries, but quite striking that it was medium and low skilled workers that were affected, and in the Central and Eastern European countries, the medium skilled workers actually play a very important role in the labor force. So this is why this is some concern. You see that the high skilled workers actually added jobs during that period. If you go to unemployment, you see that unemployment levels are still not where they were at the beginning, actually higher as they were at the beginning of the crisis. And again, obviously the countries that were most affected, such as the Baltic countries, are still having rather high unemployment rates, and some countries that in terms of GDP decline didn't do so well, such as Romania, still have rather low unemployment rates, which doesn't mean that things also in those countries may not change in the future. But maybe there's sort of one silver lining is that unemployment doesn't rise anymore, that it really sort of somehow seemed to have hit the peak and is slowly declining, but, or at least maybe leveling off. Looking at the features of unemployment, is very similar to the employment situation, that it is youth that is affected over proportionately, and you have really extremely high unemployment rates among young people in the Baltic states, and appallingly high, I should say, unemployment rates in countries such as Southeast Europe. If you look at Macedonia or Serbia, Montenegro, sort of with 50% youth unemployment, this is really something to worry about, as Bosnia as well. Again, it's the low-skilled that are affected more strongly, and this unemployment rates among that group has strengthened, as well as long-term unemployment. And wrapping up with the future prospects, what we see is that there is some recovery among those countries in the employment situation. However, the recovery is really, again, uneven, and there are different paths of recovery that are taking place. There are those countries where there were large productivity losses due to output losses, and their employment really will not pick up for a considerable time. Those countries that had these dramatic losses, such as the Baltic countries, sort of for our institute, we expect that there will be some increases just for the fact that the decline has been so dramatic before. But again, it will not be reaching the levels that were had before the crisis. And then there are these countries, such as the Southeast European countries, where GDP growth will not be sufficient to really cover to give the incentive for employment to growth. So these labor markets will really remain stagnant, and the large economies in the neighborhood of the European Union, in Russia and the Ukraine, will also remain subdued, and there will not be a lot of movement coming from there. So there really is a risk of this cyclical unemployment and difficulties in the labor market situation to become structural. And what I should end, which I think we will sort of talk about later, is really important that those countries in Central and Eastern Europe didn't have the means to really put in place a lot of counteractive measures. So they didn't have the means to, for example, do labor market policy, active labor market policy, or give employment supports with shortened work weeks in the way that Germany or for that matter Austria could do. Active labor market expenditures are really very low, and there's sort of a lot of room that could be done. There isn't really a lot of possibilities also in terms of budgetary room that those countries can use. There's some of them use some measures from the European Social Fund, but in general, there's a restriction of really doing sufficiently, doing something in terms of policy measures. Thank you.
Thank you very much.